Welcome, everyone. Welcome to another live stream. It's your host, Danny Dhaiphong. Please do, as you come in, hit that like button. Thank you very much. That helps boost this stream in the algorithm. It's so good to be with you this evening. It's going to be a little bit more of a relaxed evening. It's Sunday evening, but unfortunately, the world situation is not relaxed. So give me a quick sound check. Let me know how I sound. We're going to cover some really critical stories going on around the world. Apologies for the delay in the introduction. Needed to get things ready to go. Please let me know how everything is. Okay, people are saying that the sound is good. All right. Well, we have a big show tonight. Okay, we have on deck several stories. The first story I'm going to get to has to do with NATO member states, in particular the UK and France, once again poking the Russian bear, attempting to cross red lines that they will mightily regret, but nonetheless it is happening. I'm going to get into what I mean by that. Then we're going to talk about Gaza. We're going to talk about, in particular, the attempts by the elite to pin the blame of unrest happening on college campuses on Russia, China, and Iran, and talk about how the United States is trying to, and not only is it a party to, if not the primary facilitator of the genocide happening in Gaza committed and perpetrated by Israel, but it's trying to use this genocide now cynically as an opportunity to forward its foreign policy aims. Many would say that was the plan all along. Now we are getting proof with rumors of and murmurs of the Biden administration trying to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. A pipe dream, but nonetheless, it is happening. I'm going to get into it. And then the last story we're going to talk about has to do with China. Xi Jinping right now is traveling across Europe, France, Serbia, Hungary, and the United States is doing its best to undermine this trip to Europe through escalating its own war maneuvers, even as we have a narrative now, even among the right, Matt Pottinger and other neocons attempting to paint the Biden administration's policy as somehow about détente. So we have a lot to get to, okay? And we're going to get started right away. So please do hit that like button, hit that notifications bell, subscribe to the channel. All of that helps support this program for free. If you are able, it would be amazing if you could go to the video description. You can find patreon.com/DannyHaiFong there, where you can become a yearly member, get a free PDF copy of my book, as well as many other opportunities to ask questions, suggest guests, and other kinds of perks. And you can also join Substack if you prefer that. You can become a YouTube member here. You can also become a one-time donor to PayPal or buy me a coffee. All of these are great options. So please do consider doing all that in the video description below. All right, everybody, we are going to get started right away here. So let us do that. Let me just pull up the materials. Thanks so much again for coming. It is Sunday here, Sunday night where I am based. Ooh, it looks like I didn't go live on Rockfin. Sorry, Rockfin family. It looks like we are live now on Rockfin. Hello to everyone on Rumble. We should all be live there. And we are here live on YouTube as well. All right, let's do this. It seems that the more that Ukraine finds itself in a perilous position in NATO's war, the harder and faster NATO's escalations with Russia become. Even in just the last several weeks, we have seen NATO member states in an unhinged manner provoke Russia further, even though the overall project Ukraine has been an abject failure and is continuing along that path. What do I mean by this? So, we have David Cameron, the so called foreign minister of the United Kingdom, the head foreign officer of the UK Parliament. He has come out and declared that Ukraine has the right not just to use UK arms and weapons that have been shipped to Ukraine over the past several years now since the conflict began in its proxy war against Russia. Ukraine has the right to use these weapons, but Ukraine has the right to use these weapons against Russia on Russia's territory. So there have been dozens upon dozens of attacks on Russian territory committed by Ukraine, famously on the Belgorod region. But now we have, for one of the first times in NATO's history, a open declaration that Ukraine can use these weapons on Russia's territory, which is a major escalation. So here's the Atlantic Council giving the report. UK gives Ukraine green light to use British weapons inside of Russia. So for those of you who don't know, the Atlantic Council is essentially the think tank of the NATO alliance itself. So, but by no means is this some kind of impartial source. So it says Ukraine can use British supplied weapons to strike targets inside of Russia, UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron stated on his May 2nd visit to Kiev. Ukraine has that right, he told Reuters. Just as Russia is striking inside Ukraine, you can quite understand why Ukraine feels the need to make sure it's defending itself, which is very interesting because Russian territory is not in Ukraine. Defense usually means you are defending your own land. So that that in and of itself is a contradiction by Mr. Cameron, who, mind you, was he was the one who oversaw the UK's involvement in the destruction of Libya. So the British Foreign Secretary's comments represent a departure from the cautious position adopted by most of Ukraine's Western partners over the past 2 years. Since Russia's full-scale invasion began in February 2022, the majority of countries backing Ukraine have insisted that Western weapons can only be used within Ukraine's international borders and not be deployed against targets inside of the Russian Federation. These restrictions reflect widespread concerns in Western capitals over a possible escalation of the current war into a broader European conflict. Moscow has skillfully exploited the West's fear of escalation, with Kremlin officials regularly warning of Russian red lines and Vladimir Putin frequently making thinly veiled nuclear threats. So far, these intimidation tactics have proved highly effective. So here's what's so ironic is that on the one hand, they try to paint Russia as completely out of control and almost insane, unhinged, right? It's the unhinged one. Mind you, we are talking about the UK saying that weapons from the UK can be used on Russian territory to strike Russia, which essentially makes the UK a party to an overall collective West conflict against Russia. But it's Russia that's the unhinged one. Meanwhile, they say it's effective. It's by threatening to escalate war, Moscow has been able to slow down the flow of military aid to Ukraine while also deterring the delivery of certain weapons categories and limiting Kiev's ability to strike back against otherwise legitimate targets inside Russia. So NATO, of course, the NATO think tank, the Atlantic Council, is saying that there are legitimate targets inside of Russia. And of course, what they mean by this is by portraying this as an invasion, by portraying this as Russia is the one who is offensively going into Ukraine rather than defending itself from NATO encroachment, that Ukraine then should have the right to target especially military installations and other kinds of military related institutions inside of Russia. That would be fair, right? According to NATO. This has placed Ukraine at a significant military disadvantage, already massively outgunned and outnumbered by its larger, wealthier adversary in Russia. Ukraine has had to defend itself without the ability to deploy Western weapons against Russia's military infrastructure. Critics of this approach claim the West is effectively making Ukraine fight against a far larger opponent with one hand tied behind its back. So we don't even have to go further than this because that's the report. The report is that this is what the UK, this is what Mr. Cameron is saying. This is what he says is reasonable. And essentially, what NATO is saying, what the Atlantic Council is saying is, of course, you should allow Ukraine to target Russia inside of Russia. That's a great idea. This means that the war will go not only further in terms of its length, it will continue onward. It'll be a permanent conflict, which NATO wants it to be. And so, of course, the arms manufacturers that control NATO member states want it to be. But also, it not just increases the length of time that this war will continue, it also will create an even bigger conflagration, which we have been saying on this channel for a long time, NATO truly and genuinely wants. It's just a matter of how. So obviously, David Cameron, what he's saying is that there is a possibility, there's an opportunity to strike against Russia now. In many ways, this is an act of desperation because, as I will show you later, the situation objectively does not really call for such escalations, given the fact that Ukraine is by no means in an advantageous position to begin such hostile offensive operations on a larger scale. But here we go. Here is the second major escalation from a NATO member state. And guess who it is? You see Zelensky there. This is a Newsweek article. While you have Zelensky there on the image, who we are talking about right now is Emmanuel Macron in France. Now, this is the umpteenth time that Emmanuel Macron, just before Xi Jinping arrives to see Emmanuel Macron, and by the time this video is seen by many, that meeting will have taken place. But as it was coming, as the big France-China bilateral meeting was coming, Emmanuel Macron once again opened his mouth and said not only that NATO troops, that France and other NATO members should be more than open to sending their direct military forces into Ukraine to fight Russia, but that there are particular conditions that would make this not just a possibility, but really a necessity. So here are those conditions. It says Ukraine's Western backers in NATO and Europe will have to consider committing troops to the war-torn country under two conditions, said Emmanuel Macron. He told The Economist this in an interview. He said, quote, if the Russians were to break through the front lines, if there were a Ukrainian request, which is not the case today, we would legitimately have to ask ourselves this question. So those are the two conditions. Those aren't really tough conditions. Basically, Emmanuel Macron says it is more than necessary to send NATO troops, to send NATO member state troops to Ukraine if they are requested by Ukraine and if Russia breaks the front line. So two conditions. Russia breaks the front line, which, to be quite frank, as we will see in a bit, that is happening already. Ukraine requesting is really the last domino to fall. If Ukraine were to announce, were to communicate in some way to who? Well, to NATO, to Jens Stoltenberg, perhaps, to Biden, perhaps, because truly the Washington is the master of NATO. That would make it a necessity for NATO member states to meet and begin planning and deliberating the deployment of troops. So, Ukraine supporters, although supplying billions in military aid to Kiev, have balked at the idea of sending troops, a move that could draw NATO more directly in conflict with Russia. Macron debuted the potential for NATO troops in Ukraine in late February. As I said, this was his umpteenth time saying this. He said that although there's no consensus or combat personnel back in February, nothing should be excluded when it came to supporting Ukraine. It is not unthinkable, he added, to deploy NATO troops to Ukraine, added Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski. Well, we shouldn't be surprised by that one. Macron's comments shook other NATO leaders, while several of them quickly downplayed the potential of NATO troops on the front lines. For example, Olaf Scholz, German chancellor, said, quote, "There will be no ground troops, no Ukrainian soil, no soldiers on Ukrainian soil there by European countries or NATO states. Boots on the ground is not an option for Germany," said German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius. U.S. President Joe Biden said early on in more than a 2-year-old war that U.S. forces will not be engaged in conflict in Ukraine. And in March 2024, Biden said Kiev was not asking for American soldiers. So it's still not a popular thing. But here is a really interesting comment to add on to what Emmanuel Macron said. So, of course, to both David Cameron's and Emmanuel Macron's comment, Russia was fuming, of course. They said about Emmanuel Macron, the very fact that France is discussing sending certain contingents to Ukraine from NATO countries is a very important new element. And of course, they call it a major escalation. They said the same about what the UK had to say. So Russia, of course, is fuming. Emmanuel Macron, though, added here. He said, "I'm not ruling out anything out because we are facing someone who is not ruling anything out." Of course, Russia being the big boogeyman here. France, he said, quote unquote, "deployed several thousand troops to the Sahel region of Africa to combat terrorism at the request of sovereign states. I think to rule out a priori is not to learn the lessons of the past 2 years." That's what Emmanuel Macron said. Well, what's so interesting about that for Mr. Macron about the Sahel is that France right now is actually on the retreat on the African continent. You had French troops being kicked out of Burkina Faso recently, Niger recently. It has been a rolling catastrophe for French interests, French neo-colonial interests in West Africa in particular. So no doubt this idea that French troops would be a panacea, they can't even maintain against smaller countries that they had politically attempted to control to even a more direct degree than Ukraine. Because let's be honest, Ukraine is a multi-party collective West project led by the United States. But Niger, that's mainly a French project, of course, with US backing. Now, France has been completely kicked out of that region almost entirely. But the big problem here in many estimations and in anyone who has been paying attention is that while these comments are no doubt dangerous coming from the United Kingdom, coming from France, they do represent the potential danger that Russia and NATO are still and remain on a collision course for a disastrous global conflagration that we have not yet seen in history. The fact of the matter is that NATO is in no position to even be making these threats and to insinuate that this would be successful because Ukraine is being completely routed right now on the battlefield. In order for something like military operations on the soil of your adversary to be successful, well, you're going to have a pretty strong position overall in the war. That is why the attacks on Belgorod and other parts of Russia along the Ukrainian border have been so non-consequential. It's because Russia has been in command in this war for many, many months now, and it's only been getting worse. So here you have Sergei Shoigu. What did he have to say? Well, the top defense chief in Russia said that 111,000 Ukrainian troops had been killed or taken out of action in this year alone. How many months? has 2024 been now? We're only in the 5th month of 2024. According to Sergei Shoigu, who issued new estimates of military casualties for Ukraine, military losses for Kiev since the beginning of the year surpassed 111,000. Russian forces continue to break up Ukrainian defensive positions along the entire front line, a senior official reported during the ministerial meeting. Russia's territorial gains this year have amounted to 547 square kilometers. He added, so that's not an incredibly huge amount of territory. But let's be honest, any territory gained in a war of attrition just means that you are in a much stronger position in that war. And 111,000 is just such a it's just such a mind-boggling number given how many months we have experienced so far this year. Shoigu accused the U.S. and its allies of pressuring Kiev into disregarding the cost of continued fighting. As a result, Ukraine suffered 1,000 casualties daily throughout April. Oof. Kiev has ramped up its mobilization efforts due to high attrition, Shoigu added, claiming that Ukrainians are unwilling to fight or being forced to the front line and certain death. The Russian defense chief accused leadership in Kiev of sacrificing citizens for the sake of continued Western financial and military assistance. In April, Shoigu estimated Ukrainian casualties approached 500,000 since the hostilities with Russia started in February 2022. So what does this mean? This means that Ukraine's casualties are much higher than at any point in the conflict, according to at least Russian estimates. But it's not just Russia that is saying this, because oftentimes when we talk about Russian estimates, what do we get? We get a response that we are just being Putin's puppets. We're agents of the Kremlin. We are just spouting propaganda for Russia. Well, the propaganda for Russia has somehow reached the Guardian, okay? Putin on our doorstep. Ukraine watches as the front line edges closer. Russian forces are advancing in the country's eastern regions, but the recent arrival of U.S. arms could help turn the tide. Mind you, it's not going to help turn the tide, but I'm going to actually fast forward because there's a lot of anecdotal, not so useful, how should I say, commentary here. So here we go. It says, the Kremlin said that Ukraine's eastern provinces are part of quote-unquote historical Russia. In 2014, it swallowed up the two main cities in the Donbass region, Donetsk and Lugansk. In 2022, Russian troops occupied most of Lugansk province. One of the Russian president's key war aims is to reach the administrative borders of the Donetsk Oblast. So the reason why I read that is because this is the meat of what we need to know. That objective seemed impossible in the past, but now, through a string of Ukrainian garrison cities are suddenly in peril as Russian combat units move forward, supported by planes dropping lethal glide bombs. And those glide bombs, mind you, if you listen to people like Brian Berletic of the New Atlas and other military experts, they talk about these glide bombs as being completely out of reach of what few Ukrainian air defenses still exist. So that's a big advantage for Russia's military. Putin's generals are using classic Soviet military tactics from the Second World War, and they're trying to encircle Ukrainian troops on multiple fronts. The capture of Ocheretin means Moscow has tantalizing options. It can push west through Rodivka to the city of Pokrovsk, a key Ukrainian military base, or its forces can head north. If Russia manages to capture the city of Chasiv Yar, it can simultaneously advance from the south, chopping off a further large chunk of Ukrainian territory. For now, Ukraine is hanging on to Chasiv Yar. Months of bombardment have turned its multi-story communist-era blocks into flats into blackened stumps. The Russians have reached the city's eastern outskirts. Fierce fighting continues. But if Chasiv Yar falls, Moscow can use this elevated position to hit a string of nearby military cities. And I'm not even going to try this. Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinivka. They are home to tens of thousands of civilians as well as to many servicemen. The future of Ukraine's Donbass as a place for normal life seems increasingly bleak. So, mind you, normal life to the Guardian and to the neocons is a life under NATO shelling, a life under Ukraine's shelling, a life of terror, so to speak. But nonetheless, here you see the map, and this is just what the map that the Guardian is using, but you can see Russian forces basically have surrounded are basically at the doorstep of Chasiv Yar. They've moved already far west of Avdiivka, took this small village, I believe, here, and they are moving forward fast to the west. So, in all, this this is a situation that is just not good for Ukraine. And not only is it not good, but it points to the recklessness of NATO attempting to, through its narrative, through its threats, through its verbose leaders, just thumping their chests like Emmanuel Macron. It just shows how reckless these moves are and how it certainly doesn't help Ukraine, and it definitely doesn't help the world, which desperately wants to see this conflict come not just to an end, but to an end that recognizes the legitimate interests of Russia and, of course, the majority of the world, because the majority of the world in the global south, we're not talking about Western, collective West puppet regimes of Washington. We are talking about the rest of the world. The rest of the world sees this conflict as existential as Russia has seen it. So, or as Russia has viewed it. Now, these threats by NATO, we have to really see them as U.S. threats. They're not just threats that are made because the collective West has some kind of independent vendetta. You hear it all the time from Xi Jinping. What does he say? Whenever he talks about Europe and whenever China talks about Europe, they talk about how Europe needs to assert its own strategic autonomy. And why do they say that? Because China, just like Russia, and just like much of the world, sees how Europe has become a vassal of the United States. Now we're going to put on friend of the show, Scott Ritter, was recently on the mother of all talk shows with friend of the show, George Galloway. And this is what he had to say, Scott Ritter had to say about the situation of the collective West. And I think this is an apt analysis because it gets into how the United States as an empire doesn't just control states that are often perceived as weaker in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, and the so-called global South. It's not just these countries that are being dominated. It's the fact that the United States has dragged Europe along in its imperial policy, and it's just that Europe has not complained one bit. And here is what Scott had to say about this.
After the United States sought to dismantle the British Empire and the French Empire and the Dutch Empire, we replaced it with an American empire. And that's where we are today. We're committing the sins of empire. The British, we flipped the roles. America used to be a colony of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Today, the British people are, you are a colony of the United States. You can't exist without us. You are nothing without us. You stand for nothing. You've allowed yourself to be so deeply subordinated to us that you are, in fact, one and the same, except you're not, because we don't view you as equals. To us, you're simply a colony that we will use and then dispose of, just like we're disposing of Ukraine, just like we'll dispose of everybody else. But this is about American empire. This is about sustaining American empire. And we treat the British like we treat the French, like we treat the Germans, like we treat everybody in Europe as subordinates who are there to do our bidding. We have basically put the French and the Germans in an untenable situation. They've been locked into bad policy. They have no other options, just like the British have no other options. I mean, they do. They could listen to you, but that's right now. That seems unlikely. The way your government has been created, the political and economic elites that back your government and my government, it's the same. It's all about money, the corruption of money, the corruption of power. We allow the lure of big homes, big cars, big bank accounts to cause us to turn a blind eye to what really matters, which is human beings, the human dignity, and an absolute necessity for us to run to the aid of humans who are suffering, but we're ignoring them. We've stifled their shouts. We've turned a blind eye to the horrific images that are.
So that is what Scott had to say. I mean, I wanted to play that because that is exactly what is going on in Europe. Europe, of course, is not listening to the likes of George Galloway, the UK through David Cameron's comments, France through Emmanuel Macron's comments, are firmly in the grip of the American empire. They are doing its bidding. They are its junior partners. They see a huge benefit to themselves. They see being patrons of the American empire as the best bet for their continued illegitimate rule. Mind you, the vast majority of governments in the collective West are massively unpopular by their own populations. This is how they are attempting to maintain control, by saddling up with the most powerful force, military force, and political force in the collective West, and that is the United States. So that is what we are seeing here with France and the UK with their recent escalations. They don't care that Ukraine is in this perilous position. They don't care that Ukrainians are suffering. They don't care that the world is suffering economically from the consequences of this conflict. And they certainly do not care about Russians and Russian people. They are actively promoting and provoking a further escalation of this conflict, which will see not only more dead Ukrainians, but of course, more dead Russians, as they feel and are more than ready and willing to take up the defense of their sovereignty, of Russian sovereignty, against the encroachments of NATO. So that is what is at stake here. What is at stake is a high alert situation, a situation that we have been saying it here on this channel from the very beginning of this conflict, that NATO crossing Russia's red line was going to lead to the unthinkable, which is a direct confrontation between Russia's powerful military force and NATO's, of course, declining military force, but no less nuclear military force. That is what the unthinkable is. That is what is coming if the likes of David Cameron and Emmanuel Macron are not shut up and put in their place, taken out of power, and replaced with a model of governance that reflects the interests of the people, not just of Europe, but of the entire world. That is really what is at stake here. And we're going to have to continue to follow this development so that we are prepared to build that kind of world in the now and in the future. All right, everyone, we're going to get rolling to the next story. All right, so keep hitting that like button, keep hitting that subscribe button if you are new to this channel. Let me just pull up the stories, okay, for the next what do we got here? We're going to be talking about the Middle East now. Well, we're going to be talking about a whole lot of things because it is a mess, okay? We have a mess of a situation, and it's no less dire, no less perilous, no less important than the Ukraine situation, okay? So let us get to this. Let me just pull up more than a few of these so we can be ready to go with few interruptions. Yeah, here we go. Here we go. Okay. It's just a night. I mean, what can we say about this? There's so much to say. All right, keep hitting that like button. We have 3,000 people here. Be sure to hit that like button so that we continue to boost the stream in the algorithm. Let's get going. The situation in Gaza remains perilous, and these are words that are likely to be spoken for many, many more months to come. Why is that? Well, the United States and Israel continue to play footsie with each other as Israel uh, refuses to relent on its ongoing campaign, so called military operation, which many have called a genocide. And this genocide has caused so many problems for Israel, for the world, for the United States, and they have mounted and piled up. Whether we're talking about the regional situation with Hezbollah clearing the so called north of Israel, where there are clashes between Hezbollah and Israeli forces every single day, some of them incredibly deadly, whether it's Yemen and the Ansar Allah movement wreaking havoc on the Red Sea, sinking ships, now reaching, I believe, the Mediterranean Sea with its blockade campaign, or whether we're talking about regionally, or whether we are talking about inside of the collective West, in particular the United States, with massive student protests which have led to immense repression from, unironically, police forces in the United States, many of whom have received direct training from Israeli forces, the IDF itself. So what we now have is an attempt as Israel. Now, a lot of people have problems with the overall position of this channel being that Israel is actually losing this war, that Palestinian resistance have mounted a really resilient and heroic fight back against this onslaught. And while the casualties are immense, Rafah is now getting hit. There's going to be a direct invasion, a full scale one likely by Israeli forces soon. But Rafah is already getting hit. It's already getting bombarded. I believe children and women have already been killed there, on top of the tens of thousands that have already been killed. But nonetheless, Israel is not winning this war because the Palestinian resistance is not going away. They are taking a more and more concerted, stern, and a powerful position in negotiations. They are the ones who are really having the leverage worldwide. Why? Because the world stands with them. That is what these student protests especially have represented, is that now in the collective West, what thin bubble and barrier existed between this massive popular resentment and opposition to Israel, the Biden administration, the collective West's wanton support of Israel, now that is beginning to burst completely and entirely, to the point where the United States media, the neocons, are desperate. So they're just coming out with they're just throwing everything out here. The New York Times had the most egregious example of this, talking about how Russia, China, and Iran are using fuel from the campus protests to exploit a U.S. divide. America's adversaries have mounted online campaigns to amplify the social and political conflicts over Gaza, flaring at universities, researchers say. So, mind you, here you have the New York Times spending an enormous amount of energy on so-called fake online activity from so-called Russia, disinformation operations, China, Iran. And as you read this, and we're not going to read the whole thing because there's a lot to get to here, and there's a broader point as to why the United States is delaying any kind of assertion of any leverage over Israel. The point here is that whenever something is not going well with the United States, whenever it is both in need of escalating tensions and war, which it has done with Russia, China, and Iran all across the board, especially in recent period with Iran and Russia. an article. So they're saying that they have talked to these social media outlets. So they said Meta has linked Russia's information operations, attributing clashes unfolding on American college campuses to the failures of the Biden administration. A newspaper controlled by the Communist Party of China said police crackdowns expose the double standards and hypocrisy in the United States when it comes to free speech. On X, a spokesperson for Iran's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Nasser Kanani, posted a cartoon of the police arresting a younger protester in the guise of the Statue of Liberty, quote, imprisonment of hashtag freedom in the USA, end quote, he wrote. As protests over the war in Gaza have spread across the U.S., Russia, China, and Iran have seized on them to score geopolitical points abroad and sow tensions within the U.S., according to researchers who identified both overt and covert efforts by the countries to amplify the protests since they started. But they say, they can't. They say the Black Lives Matter protests were directed by Russia in some degree directly in 2016 and 2020. They haven't found that, they said. But it's Russia and Iran and China, which are portraying the United States as being utterly divided and under social and political turmoil, producing nearly 400 articles in English about these protests. So what they are saying here, and I'm not going to read any more because it is absolute drivel. It is literally just a study in how stupid they think you are, how stupid the neocons think we all are. What they are saying is that just because Russia, China, and Iran are seizing on the truth, that somehow that makes them a party to influence operations. They are literally just saying what is happening and giving their opinions as if the United States has a monopoly, as if the neocons, as if the collective West has a monopoly on public opinion, on world opinion, on what it means to express opinion. Countries have the right, anyone has the right to say, wow, if something is not going well, if something looks hypocritical, if something looks incredibly brutal, if something is oppressive and repressive, well, I think I don't know. It seems to me that it is okay to express opinions on this. This is just something that world leaders have the right, human beings across the board, regardless of your position, you have the right to express your opinion. It just so happens that Iran, China, and Russia have a big platform, especially with the global South, to express these opinions and have them be disseminated. And yeah, guess what? A lot more people are also listening to the Russian position, the Iranian position, and the Chinese position a lot more these days. And a big reason for that is not because Russia, China, and Iran are nefariously trying to undermine the political independence of Americans. They're trying to take over and co-opt their political systems so that Americans will do their bidding. No, it's just that the United States and the collective West and the neocons have moved so far into a position of conflict with these countries that they have amplified the risk of war 10, 15, 20-fold, that how can anyone who's paying attention not be curious about what the other side is saying? Because all we get is the United States, the collective West, and the neocon mindset and framework over these issues. So really, it is just a total case of not just hypocrisy, not just projection, but of a failed policy of aggression, which is backfiring dramatically. And why is it backfiring, you might ask? What do you mean by backfiring? Well, a few things. The fact is, all right, we just have to look at the facts of the situation. The fact is that what's happening on college campuses is incredibly brutal. It is shocking for a lot of people, especially around the world, who hear the United States talk about democracy, they talk about democracy, they talk about the United States being the best democracy in the world, the most exceptional country, being a paragon of exceptionalism. Well, then they see images like this and they might think differently.
They're scared of fucking books.
How you feel, officer? What's scared of education? You're a big man now, huh?
So that was just one example on UCLA's campus of what has happened to these encampments. And I was at some at the City College of New York and NYU, and I was bopping around New York, and it was all the same. It was massive police presences, essentially looking to tie up and arrest en masse protesters, students, professors. It didn't matter. It was a complete, and it has been a complete and utter example of the hypocrisy of so-called free speech in the United States. You have free speech as long as you're not criticizing Israel, and as long as you're not taking action that is pressuring an end to a policy that you believe is inhumane and genocidal when it comes to Israel. If this were Russia, if these students were camping out and saying, we want Russia to stop its military operation against Ukraine, do we think that the police would have any problems? Do we think that the media would be coming after them as being dupes of Russia and China? I don't think so. I think that they would be completely supported, that they would be given institutional support. Heck, we would know the leaders of these protests by name. We would know the organizations by name. We would be hearing and seeing them every single day as heroes of democracy, as they would be getting National Endowment for Democracy funding, and they would be seen as this new age of American exceptionalism and Western exceptionalism against so-called authoritarianism. That's what would be happening. But of course, that this is something different. This is something different entirely. And this is why geopolitics always, it doesn't matter that this is supposedly a domestic issue. It's not. These students stood up against genocide, against what's happening in Gaza. They are being punished for it by the domestic forces of repression, U.S. police departments, those like in New York, which have been trained directly by the IDF in so-called counter-terror operations. But not only this, it's that these protests have also been about a deteriorating situation for the U.S.'s global standing as a whole. This is about the continued erosion of U.S. hegemony vis-a-vis the rising multipolar world. Now, the students may not know this directly. Some of them probably do. Some of them don't. People who are paying attention to these protests, wherever side of the political line you're on, you may not understand the global implications of what it means for the collective West and people within it, especially in the United States, to move further and further on the side of Palestine. It's about a lot more than just people being sympathetic about an atrocity, which is it's an atrocity. There are hundreds of Palestinians still being imprisoned and killed per day, every single day in the United States. I believe just paused one arms shipment. It's unclear why, but it doesn't even matter because the United States continues to fuel, to escalate, and to really coordinate. We have to be honest here. The United States isn't just arming, it isn't just aiding, it is helping Israel coordinate these. How could it not? The United States is a major occupant. It is the major force in the region. Israel can't do anything, not even to Gaza, without the United States knowing a whole lot about it and weighing in. We have to be quite honest about that. We have to be sober about this. Nonetheless, this is still about the United States' waning position, and it's not just about the Middle East, but the Middle East is now back on the agenda, and now there's desperation setting in to the point where not only does the United States feel like it needs to demonize students, many of whom are just for the first time becoming politically engaged or probably know very little about geopolitics and the world situation, but they feel compelled the United States' political class, the neocons, the foreign policy establishment, to label them dupes of Russia, of China, of Iran. And in many ways, this is because the United States has ulterior motives. Okay. So this is what Bloomberg was reporting early in May as talks across the board were happening. The Biden administration has been on what you could call a charm offensive, as they say, about China. Really, the United States has been trying to conduct such an offensive amid this domestic turmoil and amid really what is global turmoil, which is a huge shift away from the US's pull and sphere of influence. People are sick of the United States' way of handling and ruling the world order. So now what is the United States trying to do? It is trying to, one, demonize these protests because it is trying to push through a foreign policy achievement for the Biden administration before the election. And the Ukraine aid package is not enough. That is a nothing burger. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't move the needle. The Middle East, everyone's eyes are on Gaza. Everyone's eyes are on the situation. And what does the Biden administration want to do? Does he want to end the genocide? Nope. No, not at all. That is not what's on the table. Blinken and, of course, other representatives of the so-called State Department are a party to the Cairo talks for a so-called ceasefire, which doesn't look like it's on its way anytime soon because of Israel's intransigence. But the United States is focusing on something completely different, which is normalization. Once again, we are back to the Abraham Accords. We are back to the United States trying to resurrect something that was killed because of October 7th, because of how Israel reacted to essentially Palestine's prison break. Saudi Arabia at that time could no longer politically be seen as anywhere close to Israel on the diplomatic front and had to drop the notion that it would normalize relations with Israel. But now the United States is trying to push it through. Sullivan says the U.S.-Saudi defense pact not possible without Israel deal. So this defense pact, right, between the United States and Israel was supposed to be a huge middle finger to China, to the rest of the Middle East, to the Iran normalization situation, right? It was supposed to be that Saudi Arabia and the United States firm up their defense ties, which means that Saudi Arabia would be more of a bulwark and would be more in opposition to Iran, despite their normalization talks in Beijing with Iran last year. And that Saudi Arabia would also be, on the fast track to moving itself away from BRICS, from Russia, from China, and toward the United States. Now, here's what Bloomberg had to say in their report, because now we're seeing exactly why the United States feels so compelled to delegitimize everything about these protests, to drag their feet about a ceasefire. It's because they are more concerned about getting back to the status quo for the United States, for the U.S. empire. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan insisted the Biden administration will enter into a defense pact with Saudi Arabia only if the kingdom normalizes relations with Israel. Sullivan said in an interview with the newspaper the two issues are part of an integrated vision for peace in the Middle East and could not be disentangled. He said that President Joe Biden will publicly outline a path to a more secure Israel and a more peaceful region in the months ahead. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia are nearing a historic pact that would offer the kingdom security guarantees and lay out a possible way to normalize diplomatic ties with Israel if its government brings the war in Gaza to an end, Bloomberg reported this week, citing people familiar with the matter. The agreement faces obstacles, but would amount to a new version of a framework that was scuttled when Hamas militants attacked Israel on October 7th, triggering the conflict in Gaza. Separately, the Financial Times cited Sullivan as saying that the U.S. military aid will help Ukraine stop further gains, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so that's all about Russia. But this was just a report on this possible deal. Now, of course, in there you saw, what did it say? It says here, if its government brings the war in Gaza to an end. All right. So that's the big disappointment there for the United States, is that Israel is not bringing this to an end. They have shown absolutely no interest in bringing this conflict to an end, in bringing its genocide to an end, and thus this whole normalization talk feels pretty useless. But the point here is that the United States is not, the neocons, the foreign policy establishment, they're not focusing on what the vast majority of people around the world want, which is a real uh, a real ceasing of the hostilities. They want Israel to stop. Even the United States cannot publicly support a invasion of Rafah, for example. But the United States has been absolutely a huge reason why a ceasefire has not been reached, why Israel is able to continue to assert what looks like unending leverage against the United States. And in many cases, you could say Israel does have a lot of leverage over the United States. The United States really needs Israel, even if Israel doesn't control the United States. The United States' need for Israel is so great that Israel feels like it has the ability to assert its interests over the United States. That is why AIPAC has such firm control over U.S. politics. It's not because there's a Jewish conspiracy. It's not because the Zionists are more powerful than the neocons, or in many cases, they overlap greatly. But it's not because Zionists are in control. It's not Israelis that are in control of the U.S. government. In fact, what has happened is that the United States has needed so much control over the Middle East as a whole that without Israel, the United States feels as if its position in that region goes up in smoke. And so that means, regardless of whether Biden or Blinken or anyone else likes or agrees with what Israel is doing, they have to go along with it, because if they should take any consequential action against Israel, well, what else does the United States really have in this region? Nothing. The rest of the region would go up in smoke, fall like a house of cards. The multipolar world would be strengthened multifold, because even countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, etc., well, of course, they in many ways betray the interests of the region, of the people, and of course, Palestine. They themselves are feeling massive pressure to move in a different direction, which is why the United States is focusing on trying to normalize ties with Israel. It's a big deal. The security pact, normalization of ties with Israel. It's about reconfiguring the Middle East to pull it away from Russia, to pull it away from China, to pull it away from multipolarity, and to destroy any hope for the Palestinian people. It is all connected. That is what this is all about. That's why the student protesters have to be called agents of Russia, agents of China, agents of Iran. It's why the United States can never seem to focus on any one particular matter in the Middle East. It never can seem to focus on the immediate task at hand, because there is no immediate task at hand for the United States and for the foreign policy establishment. Gaza is simply a sacrifice. Palestinians have always been that people that have needed to be, for U.S. hegemony and U.S. interests, have needed to be in a state of complete and utter squalor, dispossessed of their self-determination ever since the United States became powerful enough after the 67 war that Israel so-called won, but really it was the downfall of Arab nationalism and unity in that region that essentially gave gave Israel that victory. But ever since then, the United States, because it came out of this position, this desperate position, really after not World War II, the Vietnam War, but it came out of that still the most powerful country in the world, and only growing because the alternative to U.S. empire was also weakening, the Soviet Union, etc. So all of that is to say is that the Palestinian people have always been to the United States foreign policy establishment nothing more than sacrificial lambs for their hegemony, and they need to be in that position in order for Israel to exist as it does, and for Israel to serve U.S. foreign policy interests as it does. Why do you think the British Empire supported Israel, supported the formation of Israel? It wasn't because they just loved. Of course, there was an ideological component. Yes, there are many of the British elite who sponsored Israel and who began to give huge support after the Balfour Declaration indeed supported Zionism and believed it to be a worthwhile and supportable project, one that had ideological advantages and similarities to the British way of thinking about the world. But that only gets to a fraction of what it was really all about. It was about the British Empire feeling like its empire was going down the drain in this region and that it wanted a foothold forever and was willing to sponsor one of the most evil regimes ever to exist on the face of the earth in order to maintain that. And of course, it only got supplanted by the United States not too long afterward. So that is the story of Israel. Israel really is a story of U.S. foreign policy interests and the policy interests of empires, Western empires. And now Israel has its own vision to become its own kind of empire. That's why its foreign policy objectives don't merely include Palestine and Palestinian people. It's not just about eradicating all of Palestine and going from the river to the sea, as the Likud party's constitution says. It's not just about that, but it's about going even further than that. And now I want to just show you how, while the Biden administration and the neocons try to talk about and delegitimize these protests as some kind of aberration, as some kind of foreign manipulated activity and operation from their adversaries. The truth of the matter is that the geopolitical situation is starting to backfire big time, to the point where even liberal establishment, neocon really establishment outlets like the Atlantic say, when voters care about foreign policy, generally they don't. But for Biden, Gaza could make the election different. I mean, this is something you don't really get. It is true. The United States is not really dictated by foreign policy interests. If anyone was around in 2004, and was paying attention to politics in 2004, the Bush administration was racked by massive protests during the Iraq War. But Bush won anyway. Bush won the election anyway. So, he became a two-term president anyway, because foreign policy just wasn't driving voter opinion, and voters in the United States tend to be quite frank, historically, narrow in their outlook in many ways, because the United States politically is very narrow, and this is by design. So Joe Biden has an Israel problem, says the Atlantic. According to recent polls, more than half, in as much as 2/3 of Americans, disapprove of how he's handled the conflict in Gaza. In February, in a February primary in Michigan, more than 100,000 Democrat voters put uncommitted after critics urged voters to protest his Israel policies. Democratic voters have warned the president that his support for the Israeli operation could cost him in November's election. Will it? Most academics and pollsters tend to be skeptical that foreign policy can swing elections. Americans almost always care more about domestic issues than international ones. Their views on foreign events tend to be weakly held and malleable. Voters will typically align them to match those of their party or their favorite candidates. Their opinions may be more solid when American lives are at stake, but that's not the case in Gaza. But this year may be different, or maybe Israel is different, because even academics and pollsters are saying that the war in Gaza could be electorally significant in 2024 in a way other international issues, including Ukraine, probably won't be. I think Gaza could matter for a number of reasons, said political scientist at UC Irvine. The war, he explained, had produced a powerful brew of political forces, all which bode ill for the Democratic Party. It is a divisive issue within the party, which is home to both dedicated pro-Palestine constituencies and pro-Israel ones. It's prominent enough across news platforms and social media that people are thinking about the conflict when they focus on current affairs and politics. For younger progressives, protesting against Israel has become part of a fight for social justice. To them, the Palestinian cause is tied up to such issues as racial discrimination. The war in Gaza has also helped create a perception that Biden is hapless. The conflict is a humanitarian catastrophe that the White House has been unable to stop, leaving millions of Americans frustrated with the president. It compounds perceptions the United States is losing its international position. A majority of American voters now have poor estimation of Washington's global standing under Biden's leadership. So there you have it. Okay, there you have it. Uh, Joe Biden just won enough votes electorally last time around to beat the incumbent Donald Trump. And now in key states where there's major constituencies that have likely relationships to Palestine in some ways, major Arab, for example, populations in the state of Michigan, Muslim practicing populations in the Midwest, those are likely not to go well for Joe Biden this time around. So there's electoral reasons for this, but the geopolitical and the electoral are very connected now in ways that we have not foreseen. And that's because the United States' global standing is diminishing. That's because the multipolar world is rising. It's because not only has the United States found itself completely just caught up in a quagmire in Ukraine, but it also has found itself looking as if it has absolutely no capacity to tap into whatever alignment, right? Whatever alignment existed between the political class and the so-called values of American exceptionalism and democracy and freedom and all of this nonsense, which I on this channel have been talking about as being smokescreens for empire for many years. Now it is being exposed up front for everyone to see, including those who are completely new to politics and who have seen the horrors in Gaza for the first time, these kind of horrors for the first time in their lives. They're witnessing a genocide of a generation, and it is not boding well. So the Biden administration, through all of this, through the horrific PR, that is coming out of these protests for the Biden administration. You have cops just brutalizing young students, many of whom are just sitting in a tent or just passing out literature or just supposedly trespassing on property that they're probably paying $50,000 a year to attend anyway. Um, they're being mass arrested. They are being brutalized, in some ways, being shot at. There's just really just damning footage coming out on these things. But not only this, but you have the genocide happening in Gaza. I think it's great that a lot of these students have said, "Don't take your eyes off Gaza." Well, this is still happening there. The regional conflagration, the conflict amongst the axis of resistance and the United States continues to loom. And what is the United States doing? What is the foreign policy establishment doing? It is attempting to normalize relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Why? Because that's what the United States wanted to do before October 7th. It wants to move on. That's what the United States is basically telling the world, that it wants to move on. It wants to get back to its own priorities, that at this moment, its priorities are to find any possible way to include Russia, to include China, to include Iran, to include geopolitical matters into its domestic affairs, because that's most important, is to keep the empire's propaganda going. And then another priority is to try to get its top allies in the region, its most brutal allies historically, and one of whom, Saudi Arabia, which has been increasingly looking for a more diverse international portfolio, a more diverse relationship with the world, to move Saudi Arabia back into the U.S. orbit by normalizing with Israel and essentially putting the nail in the coffin for Palestine indefinitely. because that will make Israel a permanent feature politically as it currently is constituted. And that means the United States' position in the Middle East will be permanently, um, permanently held for, at least in its opinion, it's permanently for as long. That's not how it's going to go, but that is how the United States foreign policy establishment is looking at this. And it is incredibly reckless. It's incredibly dangerous. And it is something that I think teaches us all a profound lesson about geopolitics. When there is a war to be had, when there is an empire to maintain, when there is hegemony at stake, you can bet on the US foreign policy establishment in using all of its tools of information warfare, of proxy warfare, of direct intervention, all of the tools at its disposal to um, to pursue its narrow, selfish, self-serving interests. And that is what we are seeing here. And that is why we are in desperate need of a new world order where countries like Russia, China, Iran, as well as the rest of the global south, have a more commanding position, have a position that is equal to the weight of their actual relationship and influence on world affairs is, meaning that they deserve to be represented, they deserve to have self determination, they deserve to have the ability to construct a different way of life. If that is what the people, if that is what the nations of the global south truly want, and indeed we are already seeing that happen, and we are seeing how Gaza has basically changed the calculus of everything, has created a huge problem for the US empire. And it's one that's not going away. And it's one that eventually is going to lead to what we're already seeing: more unrest domestically, more a bigger shift toward a multipolar world. And of course, what that means is a major confrontation on the world stage where the empire, the American empire, the neocons are going to attempt to use one of its flanks and fronts of warfare to escalate and to try to drag the world into another permanent conflict, which of course will be unwinnable, but that's not the point anyway. The point is to keep the chaos going, to keep the profits rolling, and to keep the empire as sturdy as it can be. The problem is that the more that it goes about this route, this is the contradiction, the more that it goes about this path, actually, the more that it backfires and the more unstable it is becoming. All right, everyone, we got one more story to go. Okay. Thanks for tuning in. We still have about 2,800 people here. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit that notifications bell. Thanks so much for tuning in tonight on a special Sunday live stream. We're going to continue onward. Okay. Let's see. um yeah, we're gonna go to China next. All right. Man, every time I do a China story, I just don't know. I don't know what to say. I think it's ridiculous how we keep ending up having to say very similar things. Okay, I need to archive this one. Sorry about that. Um, sorry. Some of these sources, sometimes the paywall comes up, and so give me a minute just to get this story going. This one has many different twists and turns. Okay. Uh, but it'll be a good one nonetheless. All right, here we go. That's not it. Here it is. Okay. Just when you think that there's a flashpoint that is hold on. No. Let's start that over again. Let's start that over again. Apologies everyone. I am quite tired. Let's do this, okay? Just when you thought that out of the many flashpoints of US directed warfare exist, that there is a possibility that just one of them is letting up. Well, what ends up happening is that we find out that under the surface, what's not being reported, or at least what's not being paid attention to, and it's being reported, but it is not finding the sufficient attention to these reports. What we end up finding out is that the United States remains on the path of warfare in basically all parts of the world. But the three major flashpoints of the American empire, of the neocons at this point, are, of course, all eyes are on the Middle East, Gaza, and the broader regional situation, the axis of resistance, and the US's attempt to stymie it and its failure to do so. And then, of course, you have Ukraine, which has for the last 2+ years now been perhaps the biggest story in major part because it's the prelude to a broader US NATO war with Russia, a major power in this growing multipolar world. But less paid attention to now is the ongoing US aggression toward China. So this channel often covers the latest in what the United States is doing with regard to its policy on China, and that is very intentional. It is because the United States, at every turn, even when it seems like there are improving relations between the US and China at any single moment, whether it's November 2023, the APEC summit, the Asia Pacific Economic economic cooperation summit, whether it was the several meetings that have occurred between Janet Yellen and Antony Blinken over the last year and a half. Still, the United States maintains a very hostile posture toward China. And this is no less true than right now, where even as China is embarking right now under the leadership of Xi Jinping, a historic Europe tour. First to France, where China is going to tell France it needs more strategic autonomy and it needs to be the country that has claimed that it has strategic autonomy to now start to finally assert it. Then then Xi Jinping is going to go to Serbia. And on May 7th, Serbia will commemorate, and China will commemorate the NATO bombing in Belgrade of the Chinese embassy, which killed 3 journalists. That happened in May 7th, 1999. And then, of course, Hungary will be the last stop on this trip to Europe, which, of course, marks a huge message by China that the Belt and Road Initiative is really firming up its presence, especially on Europe's eastern flank. But the real story is that as China has been going on kind of a diplomatic offensive of late in many respects, whether it's trying to ease tensions with the United States, build up its international relations and cooperation with the rest of the global south, or whether it is its its attempt to ensure that the European market remains one that is stable toward Chinese ties. The United States continues to try to undermine China's position now by assembling another military alliance of allies to counter China, supposedly in the Indo-Pacific, as they call it. So, Secretary of State Lloyd Austin met with his counterparts from Australia, Japan, and the Philippines on Thursday, May 3rd, as the U.S. deepens ties with an emerging regional group. It's Thursday, May 2nd. As the U.S. deepens ties with an emerging regional group, Pentagon officials have now privately nicknamed the Squad. So there already was a Quad, mind you, as they're going to say. It's just one of a number of regional partnerships that was used to push back against China's assertiveness in Asia. So, for example, the Quad of U.S., Australia, and Japan, and AUKUS, Australia, the UK, and the U.S. We've gathered here because we share a vision of peace, stability, deterrence in the Asia Pacific, says Austin. We've charted an ambitious cause to advance that vision together. The defense chiefs of the Squad met for the first time in June 2023 on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Security Dialogue in Singapore. In April, the four nations conducted joint maritime patrols within the Philippines Exclusive Economic Zone against the backdrop of ongoing tensions with Manila and Beijing over territorial claims in the South China Sea. Austin announced the four-country group would look to undertake more maritime exercises, as well as providing greater assistance to the Philippines. The U.S. has been clear to all nations, including China, that recent behavior in the South China Sea was irresponsible and disregards international law. So, China views the multilateral grouping as part of Washington's attempt to contain China. So the Global Times ran this week, warned that the grouping risks exacerbating regional risk. A U.S. official who requested anonymity to discuss the Squad said the grouping aims to counter coercion and aggression across Asia, as well as ensure defense capabilities and militaries are increasingly operable, allowing them to work more efficiently together in the event of a conflict. A conflict with who? Right? Aggression of who? It's China. It is all about China. And the United States, the so-called Indo-Pacific Command, the so-called so-called multilateral alliances, military alliances, really, the United States has been forming. They all point to this idea that China is the aggressive country. It's China that's the aggressive country. But as you will see, the mainstream media, even the Western mainstream media, has shown that the extent of the aggression, of course, they'll frame it as defense and as security and as bringing security to the region and preparing for a war or to prevent a war kind of thing. Nonetheless, even the New York Times, right? We can go on and on and on. The New York Times has talked about a new Pacific arsenal to counter China. With missiles, submarines, and alliances, Biden has built a presence in the region to rein in Beijing's expansionist goals. So it's Beijing that's expansionist. Meanwhile, the United States is traveling thousands of miles to build up its military arsenal. So, Papua New Guinea. The U.S. have long seen their country as a Pacific power with troops and arsenals and a handful of bases in the region since World War II. And here you see Papua New Guinea there. You can see the bases in Australia. Biden administration says that it is no longer good enough to foil what it sees as the greatest threat to the democratic island of Taiwan, a Chinese invasion that could succeed in days. So the U.S. I mean, this format is very interesting, right? So let me just zoom in. The United States is sending the most advanced Tomahawk cruise missiles to Japan and has established a new kind of Marine Corps regiment in Okinawa, designed to fight from small islands and destroy ships at sea. The Pentagon has gained access to multiple airfields and naval bases in the Philippines, lessening the need for aircraft carriers that could be targeted by China's long-range missiles and submarines in the time of war. So I think it's jumping to these parts of the world, but because I had to archive it, it was paywalled. You're not seeing the planet, but you're getting. So you see there's marine submarine bases. Australian government hosts U.S. Marines in the north of the country, and one of 3 sites in the east will soon be home to advanced American-made attack submarines. It also has a new security agreement with Papua New Guinea. Mind you, That's an AUKUS deal, and that's not going to happen anytime soon. But nonetheless, it's still significant. So here you have the New York Times just going on and on and on about what's going on. And of course, Xi Jinping calls it military encirclement. China calls it military encirclement. So nonetheless, that's just the New York Times talking about some of the things that the United States military is doing that's showing that it is, in fact, the aggressor. But I'm going to show you more, okay? The the Newsweek magazine. Here's Newsweek. Earlier this year, it says a map shows U.S. military projecting power around China. I'll show you the map. It's kind of a pathetic map. I don't find it too useful, but the content in this article certainly goes over, from a mainstream media perspective, exactly how aggressive the United States is certainly pushing for war with China, and it's doing so right now. So quickly here, it says the services of the U.S. Armed Forces have led or joined at least 20 multinational training events in the Western Pacific since January 2024. This was written in March, with the aim of maintaining readiness to face adversaries, including North Korea and rivals like China. In the Indian and Pacific Oceans, a combined theater of operations, the Pentagon says, will remain priority for decades to come. American troops have been deployed for nearly 10 weeks in various bilateral, trilateral, and multilateral exercises. This is according to public releases by the Hawaii-based U.S. Indo-Pacific Command and its regional constituents. Last month, the second anniversary of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, the National Security Council said historic progress had been made to ensure the region remained favorable to the United States and American staying power in an age of great power competition. Advisor Joe Biden, who campaigned on a promise to reinvigorate existing alliances in the region, have touted successes, including growing trilateral defense partnership between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. This was once thought unlikely because of decades-long wartime grievances. The breakthrough at Camp David last August sent a clear message to China, as did the Philippine decision earlier in the year to grant visiting U.S. forces greater access to bases in strategic locations. Leaders in Beijing have accused American counterparts of waging a new Cold War amid a multifaceted rivalry that expands technology, military, and global governments. They've accused Washington of building exclusive blocks to grossly interfere in China's internal affairs, slander China, and lead to confrontation. So here is the map. I just don't like it, but this is just showing U.S. operations, U.S. forces in the Indo-Pacific, as you can see, just everywhere, right? Japan, around the Taiwan Straits, Vietnam, around, like right outside of Vietnam. I mean, it's just everywhere. So, not a great map, though. It's not clear about what exactly it's showing. They don't explain it in the article. But here's what they're going to write. Here's what they say are part of this graphic, right? 21 publicly announced events in 2024 showing that the U.S. military is maintaining a constant presence in the Western Pacific, including in the seas and airspace on China's periphery. In at least 9 exercises in January, the U.S. Navy held multilateral anti-submarine war games in Guam, sailed with the Philippine Navy in the South China Sea, led trilateral drills with South Korea and Japan in the East China Sea, and conducted dual anti-aircraft exercise, a dual aircraft carrier exercise in the Philippine Sea with Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force. The same month, the U.S. Army trained with South Korean and Japanese ground forces, and the U.S. Air Force flew 2 B-1 bombers to Singapore for bilateral training. In late January, a Navy destroyer sailed through the Taiwan Strait, drawing condemnations from the Chinese military, and the U.S. Coast Guard helped capacity building training in the Marshall Islands with partners from the Pacific. Practicing power projection through the Indo-Pacific during peacetime is critical for ensuring readiness and deterrence in times of contingency. Chris Singleton, a senior fellow at the Nonpartisan Foundation for Defense of Democracy at Washington think tank. So nonpartisan, but essentially an arms contractor and U.S. government funded think tank based in Washington. These exercises enhance interoperability among regional allies and partners, bolstering our collective ability to respond swiftly and effectively to emerging security challenges. It's a clear signal of resolve to potential adversaries, namely China. So there you go. Right, there you go. 2,400 troops gather at an Air Force base in Guam for one of a dozen of events in February. So we're just on and on and on. right? On and on and on. Major escalations, major buildup. And so there you have it. Newsweek admits it. There's a major buildup in the region against China. Now, why is this important? Why is this important? Because the United States, no matter how much it's trying to say that it is not going to war with these major powers in the multipolar world, their actions say differently. Do not listen to what they say necessarily, although what they say can also be instructive, but mainly we should be paying attention to what they do. So here's what one big facet of this, one big facet of why this is important is because of the psychological and geopolitical side of this. The psychological operation here is that China is aggressive. So we just saw that the military side of this, the way that the United States is portraying this, is that it is building up militarily because China is aggressive. China needs to be condemned for its activity in the South China Sea. Now, lately, there's been a really interesting way that this is being framed. Okay, and they're getting even more grandiose, I should say, with their with the neocons excuses and justifications for why they need to build up with China lately. And I want to show you how big of an operation this is. Lately, they've been saying that now China is just as powerful as the United States because it's spending just as much. They're claiming that China in 2022 likely spent 700 billion US dollars, or nearly equal to the US military budget of that year. Okay, so this is Business Insider reporting, I believe, from another report, but I don't think I could open that one and get through the paywall. But nonetheless, Business Insider said that a new report from the American Enterprise Institute, and we're going to get into them, says $229 billion of a military budget in 2022 was actually $711 billion, right? So they just say that this is actually $711 billion. Well, is it? Let's see. A similar figure was touted by lawmakers last year when they cited U.S. intelligence estimates. The report by the think tank AEI breaks down that figure to show where China's money is likely going to. They actually don't know. They're actually just making this up. But nonetheless, this is a horribly formatted article. But it says in January 2023, Dan Sullivan asked Congress of Alaska, warned Congress that China's military was catching up faster than previously imagined. Intelligence said that they estimated Beijing was spending at least $700 billion in 2022, more than triple of its $229 billion reported. So then there was a legislative push to dig further into the matter, and think tanks and observers running their own analyses. So this is a new report from the American Enterprise Institute to break down how that might have happened. They write that it's probably $711 billion when weighed against America's slightly higher than the one noted by the congressman. That makes Beijing spending nearly equal to the U.S. defense budget. Considering the Pentagon has labeled China a pacing challenge, this revelation should cause concern. She mostly pieced together the new figure by comparing older Chinese budget reports and spending breakdowns, extrapolating them on to the $229 billion announced. So basically, just taking numbers and adding them in from past reports, a very odd methodology, so to speak. It's basically just adding numbers that could likely have nothing to do with each other, especially given that I doubt the American Enterprise Institute knows how China works at all. But there you have it. That's the hard evidence. That's because China's spending reports are likely kept tightly under wraps. Most observers haven't been able to pin the $700 billion on hard evidence. Nothing. They've got nothing. They're making this up. This is how obvious it is. They literally say they're making it up. It doesn't mean that China is spending that exact money on defense either. Rather, it describes the purchasing power of its military budget compared to America's, especially considering lower wage and material costs in China. Based on a 2020 report by the UN, Eagleton wrote that its 2022 military spending was likely divided into three major categories: training, equipment, and maintenance and personnel, with purchasing power parity factored in. China likely spent the equivalent of 135 billion instead of 85 billion on equipment, 121 billion instead of 76 billion on training and maintenance, the report said. So that is what is what's so hilarious. They're literally using, so they won't use purchasing power parity to show that China's economy is bigger than the United States now, because oh no, that would be inaccurate. But they'll use it to show that actually military spending was higher. But that's not really how purchasing power parity works. Yes, purchasing power parity is more about in your own currency, what can you get in a basket of goods that is reflective in your own country versus another, right? So that's why China's economy is probably bigger in purchasing power parity, because the cost of everything is lower in China, and there's other factors and how China deals with currency, etc. That if you adjust for the currencies, you likely have a bigger economy in China. It's just true. The growth rates have been faster overall. It just came from a much poorer place. But it doesn't work in the reverse. But that's how they're trying to frame it. It works in the reverse, that you can scale up by purchasing power parity, and that means China is suddenly spending the equivalent of a U.S. dollar amount because its economy everything is just as big. That's not. That's just not how it works. But yeah, it was a nice try, I guess. But the point here is, and we're going to the point, is that it's all about framing. It's all about framing China as just as aggressive, just as dangerous, if not more dangerous than the United States. So here is what the American Enterprise Institute is all about, though, right? Literally, the Business Insider said that the U.S. intelligence had made up this number, and now they're researching the number. Do you see how this is working? That it's about making up a lie and then getting organizations to justify the lie. So what is the American Enterprise Institute? So it has its basis, and they call it a right-wing think tank. This is SourceWatch. It's SourceWatch is not equivalent to Wikipedia, I don't think, but it's very hard to find donors and information on America. They've tried to cover it up, and SourceWatch has receipts of where it got its money originally. So the American Enterprise Institute was considered by the George W. Bush administration, under the George W. Bush administration, as an intellectual command post for the neocon campaign for regime change in Iraq, which is what Vanity Fair called it. It's a dominant conservative think tank, and of course, it really formed in the wake of the Reagan era politics, all about austerity, all about war. And so I want to just get to the donors here, right? Because it's support of the Iraq War. This is the Koch brothers. It is truly a think tank that works for the neocon foreign policy establishment, especially those that were architects of the Iraq War. But here you see, okay, the board of trustees, all on the line, just major hedge funds, finance capital groups, from the Carlyle Group, which has been notorious in its dealings with arms manufacturers and conflicts in the Middle East. AQR Capital Management. So you can go on and on and on. Dell, right? These are all corporations and hedge funds that have a huge stake in war. But nonetheless, the funding, here we go. This is what's important. Between 2011 and 2017, AEI accepted donations from Altria. ExxonMobil contributed $240,000 in 2007. And its foundation funding, it comes from a whole bunch of places, but a whole bunch of big foundations. So essentially, right, it is a major think tank funded by the biggest corporations, the biggest hedge funds, and it has an ideological purpose of promoting war. And now, who is the writer of this study? We can just go right to the American Enterprise Institute's website, Mackenzie Eaglin. This is who wrote this, and she is literally a spawn of the neocon foreign policy establishment's war in Iraq, its invasion of Iraq, And then now, of course, she's been a mainstay since then. Okay, so here's where she comes from: a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, also one of the 12-member U.S. Army War College Board of Visitors. While working at AEI, she served as a member of the National Defense Strategy Commission, congressionally mandated bipartisan review, whose final report in November 2018, providing common defense, included assessments and recommendations for the Trump administration. She also served as a staff member on the 2014 congressionally mandated National Defense Panel and 2010 on the congressionally mandated Quadrennial Defense Review. So for the Obama administration, she also advised. Before joining the AEI, she worked on defense issues in the House of the Representatives, in the U.S. Senate, at the Pentagon, and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense and on the Joint Staff. Do you see who she is now? And we're going to get into exactly. There's a list I'll show you, and then she's been a writer, of course, because they all have to write. So here's her experience, her little CV. She started here, Defense Department, as a Presidential Management Fellow, 2001 to 2003. Afghanistan, and Iraq. Then she was with the Office of Representative John Sweeney, Republican of New York. All of these people, you remember the Iraq War days, they all supported the Iraq War. Then she was with Susan Collins, notorious neocon, defense advisor for her. Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel, staff member. Heritage Foundation, notorious neocon think tank. National Defense Panel, staff member, 2014 for Obama, 2018 for Trump. And now, since the president, she's been advising the Navy, commissioner on the future of the Navy, and writing reports about how aggressive China is with a basically intelligence concocted military budget number to try to make China's military just as big as the United States. The problem with all of this, of course, is that as you've seen from everything that I've shown, China is actually the one that is being targeted for the aggression. China is not putting its military installations and bases and personnel off of the coast of California or off of the east coast of the United States. It's not surrounding Puerto Rico. It isn't doing anything that the United States is doing in the Asia Pacific. And its military, even if we don't have the exact numbers, we can't scour the budgets. I mean, where could we do this? We know that the United States literally has trillions of unaccounted dollars in audits almost every single year, tens of trillions of dollars that we have no idea where they go, probably into the coffers of the super rich, of the elite. But we don't exactly know where they go. We know that the United States military industrial complex is rife with corruption, profiteering, and the like. And we don't have any we can't scour the public records for that. We have to do major investigations. That has to be unveiled. It has to be leaked. But with China, even if you don't believe that the $200 billion number or whatever it is for China is sufficient, the proof is in the action and in the behavior and in the policy. China's military has not demonstrated to be expansionist. The South China Sea, regardless of whatever one says about the policy, whether you agree or disagree with how China relates to the Philippines or any other country, doesn't really matter, because nonetheless, if you look at the geography, this could all be debated and considered part of China's territory as well, whether it needs to be shared or whether it is just China's sovereign territory. Regardless of where you stand on the debate itself reflects a geopolitical reality, that this is really China's terrain and China's issue alone, along with its neighbors, to resolve. It doesn't have anything to do with the United States. China doesn't go into U.S. affairs. It isn't parking itself off the coast of U.S. Spheres of influence along its borders. It's not doing that. So we cannot say reasonably that China's military is at all as aggressive. Look at the numbers. The United States alone in the Indo-Pacific, so-called, let's call it the Asia-Pacific, has nearly 400 military bases. China does not have foreign military bases in the Asia-Pacific. It has one base at the request of Djibouti, which in and of itself is not even a military base. It is more of a joint venture with Djibouti itself for for security over its railways, its economic venture. It has nothing to do with expanding. It's not like it's parking itself in Djibouti and saying, "Give us your bases." It's a joint agreement, and it hasn't been repeated on the African continent. Meanwhile, the United States has at least 30 plus bases and conducts hundreds of operations in the African continent, at any given moment. So all of this is to say is that the proof here is that the United States has shown itself to be the aggressor and to remain at war with China. This is coming. This major war is coming. It is not going to sneak up on us. It is not going to be some sudden conflict, not even Gaza. None of these conflicts have been sudden. No wars that the United States wage are sudden. The United States builds up to all of its wars and then finally pulls the trigger. The same with Iraq in 2003. That was not sudden. That didn't happen because of 9/11. It happened. 9/11 just happened to be a justification. Iraq was in U.S. crosshairs well before 9/11. The same goes with Afghanistan. 2001 was not the invasion of 2001, the occupation of Afghanistan in 2001 was not random. This had been a multi-decade process of maneuvering Afghanistan under the sphere of influence of the United States, first against the Soviet Union, and then as an attempt to maintain complete and total hegemony over this region so that it could dominate its resources and cut off Russia and China from key resources and, of course, key access to the European market. We can go on and on and on about all wars that the United States wage have a buildup to them, including what are now the unthinkable wars, the wars that will end all wars, the world wars, the global confrontation to come, which includes the United States on the one side and China and Russia on the other. We are witnessing the United States continue to lay the foundations for war with China, and that should give us all pause, but it also should be a lesson to all of us that just because there are more uh, dire flashpoints, whether it's Ukraine or Gaza, that deserve our attention, deserve major opposition, major critical analysis and coverage. The fact remains that if we ignore what the United States is doing around its policy toward China, then we run the risk of allowing that flashpoint to get to the level that Ukraine has gone. We're going to allow the United States to commit the same crimes, commit the same policy, which endangers all of humanity and endangers the fate of humanity itself. That is what is at stake here. But we cannot get to the point where we are taking this seriously until we just read through the lines of the mainstream media itself, not just Chinese media, which I could pull up all day and show you how Chinese media is attempting, English language media is attempting to sound the alarm about this war drive. But even the mainstream media, the Newsweek magazine, the New York Times, they are all saying it as well. They're just doing it in a way where it's framed as some kind of crusade against quote unquote aggression and authoritarianism of China for the benefit of so-called Western democracy. Nothing could be further from the truth. The truth of the matter is, it's not Western democracy, it's not U.S. democracy, it is empire. And the empire wants to not just contain China. I think that's too nice. It wants to overthrow China. It wants to conduct regime change against China. It wants China to collapse. It wants the biggest threat, as the Indo-Pacific Command often says, to the security of the world order is China, and China must be taken out. And we must oppose that at all costs because China, Russia, and the multipolar world are humanity's best chance at a prosperous and humane future, one that is not beleaguered by the ills and the problems and the oppression and the just catastrophic conditions of war and exploitation and of this so-called thing called Western civilization, which has the blood of so many millions and counting on its hands. The world has a real chance here, and a war on China would only bring about suffering, would only bring about the delay in realizing this true chance and this true opportunity for humanity. So we as people, we as those who are concerned about this, we must reject this potential outcome at all costs. All right, everybody. All right. Thank you so much for continuing to tune in. Thank you so much for all the generosity here. I'm just going to do shout outs and announcements, okay, before I head out. Thank you so much for tuning in today. All right. Wow, I am tired today. I almost didn't make it through this story. Um, here we go. All right. First, I just want to say thanks so much for all of the generosity. Um, all of the viewers who are here, of course, just viewing for free. Thanks so much to Rumble. Thanks so much to all the moderators who are here tonight on a Sunday night, standing alone. I see Desert Mantis. I don't know. Is there anyone else here? Maybe not. Maybe there's no one else here in the chat. Oh, Where Pilgrim is here. Well, that's about as far as they'll let me go. But thanks to all the moderators, of course. Thanks to everyone on Rumble, on Rockfin, of course. Thanks so much for supporting me there. Thanks to all of the Patreon supporters in the audience tonight who are watching this. Your continued support helps make this show possible. Thanks to all the Substack supporters, of course. Thanks to all the YouTube members who don't know if I caught any tonight in the chat. But I see Maxwell Sterling in the chat as a YouTube member. I don't see any others in the chat, but thanks for all those who contribute as YouTube members, whether you're in the chat or not. Of course, you can go to the video description, subscribe on Patreon, subscribe on Substack. Patreon is the best place to support this work. And you can do so annually, and that tends to be the best way people like to support. There's also, of course, Substack and one-time options like Buy Me a Coffee and PayPal. I'm going to shout out everyone who's given something today in a bit. You can be my YouTube member as well monthly. We have a great YouTube community, of course. So let's get somebody said I was drunk. I'm not drunk, I swear. Creative Experiments is here as the moderator. Shout out to you. Okay. Let's do super chats. Here we go. Oh, we have a new member today. All right, great. Artona Raharjo. Thanks so much. I'll probably butcher your name, but appreciate it. Here we have Enoch was the first prophet. If China stops lending to the U.S., how can they afford to pay for wars? If so, why doesn't China just cut America off, especially because of U.S. and Taiwan? Well, China holds a lot of dollars. It holds a lot of debts, mainly because of its own. So it has this curious situation where it is the biggest manufacturing country in the world, and it has to operate within a dollar-dominated system. So holding all these dollars and essentially then giving them to the United States allows for this economic relationship to work. So to cut it off would mean to cut off economic ties with the United States likely entirely, and that means a lot of instability. It's unfortunate. The world right now is not in a situation where this sort of thing would work. Doesn't mean that it wouldn't be a big political statement that a lot of people would support. A lot of people would support this, but it's about, is the world order ready for this? And China has long calculated that not only is China not ready developmentally, but the world situation would be um, thrown into chaos. So China, and also China has a policy that, for better or for worse, although I think it's for the better, especially in this moment where we do need stability and we need good examples. China does not believe in necessarily like eye for an eye. It doesn't believe in doing what how the United States behaves. So it's not going to use economics as a mode of warfare, so to speak. And so, China, given both that whole context I just laid out there, both in terms of the economic relationship with the United States and the world as a manufacturing hub and in a dollar-dominated economy still, even though that's changing, but it's not to the point where there's a whole system in place and you can just no one will say that. There's no one in the BRICS, there's no Russia, no China, no one will say that. So there needs to be that architecture built. And until that architecture is built, and to be quite frank, until the United States' political system is changed, this isn't a call for regime change. This is for the people of the United States to construct a better system that works for them, where they have power in it, where they can change the calculus how the United States operates in the world. Until those things happen, it'll be very difficult for even a country as powerful and as rich and as prosperous and as politically principled as China to enact a wholesale change of the world order on its own by using its leverage over the United States. It does have leverage. I mean, this is something that China doesn't necessarily not use. It certainly uses its economic relationship with the United States to say, hey, if you continue on this path, this destructive path, it's going to hurt you more. And China doesn't really have to. I mean, I always turn back to that meme of Xi Jinping. I wish I could find it. I often cannot find it, but I remember seeing it often where Xi Jinping it's just a picture of him sitting and it just says, the CIA, the CIA is reporting on China's conspiracy to just sit back and watch the U.S. empire fall, right? Like that's how I think China sees a lot of things. It sees the United States in rough shape. It doesn't want to be a party to hostility and aggression, but it will use its leverage to point out that the United States' foreign policy toward China is counterproductive in many ways to the United States. A big example of this is the trade war. I mean, look at this trade war. It's disastrous in the United States. It has increased prices. It has hurt the agricultural sector, especially farmers. It has created shortages in many areas in key goods that are important to the United States economy. So, all in all, that's how China sees it. Here is observation. The false Zionists are kicking out Al Jazeera because they're trying to pull a massive jack move against the poor of West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza, but they lack supernatural strength. Well, interesting way of putting it. Yeah, I did forget to mention that fact. You are correct. They have banned Al Jazeera from its local operations. Just another criminal move by the criminal Zionist entity that is Israel. I really, I gotta say, I enjoy reading Al Mayadeen, the Lebanese-based media, because true to the resistance axis, right? The resistance, they will never put Israel is always in quotes. And the reason why I really appreciate that is because I'm sorry, but I would I would support that for the United States too if I saw a country or people being oppressed by or whether it's Iran or whether it's Afghanistan for so many years, even up until now, whether it's regardless, if they wanted to use quotes for the United States to delegitimize, I think that is 100% valid. Why? Well, because why should a country like the United States, which doesn't even have the legitimacy of its own population behind it, why should it be acknowledged as a legitimate country? The United States has forever in its history said that this country, that country is not legitimate. It's tried to pull Russia and Syria and over out of the United Nations itself. It has tried to isolate countries like DPRK. I mean, we can go on and on and on, but the point is that I'm going on a tangent. But this criminal act by the Zionist entity only shows how illegitimate it is to the very basis of justice and any kind of these democratic principles. It's a complete and utter farce. And we do have to start questioning what kind of roots do countries like these in the United States really stand on? This doesn't mean that we can't call the United States a country or whatever. However you want to label the US, whatever, however you see it, whatever. It's not about like going back to the past and just reversing all that has happened. It's probably not materially possible to do it exactly in the way like that, but we do have to start coming up with the notion, or at least acknowledging the notion, that there are lots and lots of people that view Israel and also the United States as illegitimate nation states, as nation states founded upon the worst excesses of criminality, of domination, of colonialism, and that will have to be rectified before there can be any kind of uh, uh, um, true legitimation of a nation state. We're gonna have to. I mean, there's all these, I think, quack theories about globalization destroying nation states. I think the only thing that can destroy a nation state is like full communism, classlessness. We're very far from that. So nation states, especially in an era of dwindling and decaying empire, are going to be very important, especially for those people and those nations that don't have their self-determination, i.e. Palestine. But we can go on and on and on with examples of this. But still, there can be illegitimate nation states, and I definitely see those that rest upon the bones, ashes, blood of empire as not necessarily legitimate. So Al Mayadeen, I laugh sometimes when I see it, because it's one of those things where you're just so used to browbeating and bullying from the pro-Israeli side, especially when you're just reading news, that when you read Al Mayadeen, you see those quotes on Israel, you just gotta laugh. Even though it's a very serious matter. I don't want to delegitimize it. Let's see. Where are we? That was a generous, thank you, observation. That was a generous super chat. Observer Scribe. Okay, promoting things very creatively. Thanks so much. I won't read this, but sorry about that, guys. Sorry about that. No, it's been a long day. Here we go. Sparky. Although it's not a military alliance, do you think BRICS countries might get together and push Israel out of Gaza? I know their focus is elsewhere now, but Russia intervened in Syria, for instance. I mean, here's what I see. I think that it's a different context. So Syria, while Syria is being occupied, Syria certainly was being invaded. Syria had recognition as a state, and you could say, well, its self-determination was being trampled on. Syria had its self-determination in the legal sense, right? It's formally recognized. It's not a colony necessarily. Yes, its self-determination was being trampled on, and still is. So it's sanctions and the third of Syria that is occupied, all of that. But when Russia intervened, it did so on the basis of state-to-state relations with the permission of Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian government. Now, the difference with Palestine is that Palestine is not recognized as a state, no matter people's opinions on that. Most people believe that Palestinian people, Palestine, is a nation. It is one that deserves to have a state, or at least to be a party to a state. So if you're a two-state solution person, you believe it deserves an independent state that I guess would neighbor Israel. Seems it's kind of hard to believe would exist. And then there are those who, I believe in a one state solution. I don't even like to use those terms, but I believe that Palestinians deserve self determination and that they need to be part of a new state that is constructed and prepared to respect and enforce the respect for Palestinian self-determination and of course the rights that go along with that. So with that said, I believe that what is going to happen with BRICS is not that there's going to be some kind of direct intervention to put a stop to the Gaza situation, because um, that would inflame the situation. I mean, we already saw with Iran being very hesitant to move into a particular form of military operations which would provoke a larger war. Now, if you think BRICS countries, especially Russia and China, which I believe are the only BRICS countries that have the capabilities and the principles to conduct a military operation or any kind of direct involvement to put a stop to the Gaza madness, that would, I mean, the political situation is just absolutely uh, not in the place where that would be considered acceptable from those powers that be in the collective West, which, we can't trust their reactions. Look at this. Okay. Nonetheless, what I think will happen, and it is already happening, we see Russia and China hosting the Palestinian resistance groups, the Palestinian representatives from Hamas, from Fatah, from other resistance groups as well. We see that kind of diplomatic activity happening in the interest of creating a model for how Gaza as well as a Palestine could be governed, helping to work out internal differences first, and basically playing a supporting role for the Palestinian resistance. I do think the primary, and I do think this is the correct position. The primary goal for, let's say, a country like Iran, country like China and Russia, which are BRICS countries, is to ensure that Palestinian resistance remains Palestinian resistance. That no matter how weak or divided we may think it is, which I don't think it is, as it's definitely more unified and powerful than ever, be given that it is fighting a war to a standstill, one of the most atrocious and egregious set of war crimes and genocide ever committed in modern human history. It is fighting tooth and nail, not just for survival, but to fight this thing out until victory. Just it gives me so many Vietnam vibes in many ways, because you have the equivalent of millions of people essentially when we look at the density of Gaza, being absolutely tortured and destroyed and being systematically destroyed as a people, and yet they persist and yet they continue to resist. So I think the point of especially those BRICS countries which are prepared to assist, I mean, let's be honest, India doesn't even count here. South Africa, of course, does, because they have taken a huge stand at the ICJ with their successful case against Israel. But a lot of BRICS countries, the new countries, Saudi Arabia, Ethiopia, do I see them as prepared to take on any kind of role? No. Brazil, even, right? Brazil, very supportive of the Palestinian cause. What kind of international position? So a lot of things, for as powerful as a bloc like BRICS can be economically, the political factor is very important, and the factor of how these countries stand in the overall world situation based on their own domestic capabilities still looms very large. So, my opinion, Sparky, is that we are going to see Russia and China and Iran be the biggest supporters in BRICS and in the multipolar world of the Palestinian resistance and use their diplomatic leverage, of course, and their economic strength to essentially be the force which gives Palestine and the Palestinian resistance legitimacy worldwide, almost kind of modeling a new kind of United Nations on the Palestine question. It's kind of what's been happening. It's happening quietly because both the media in the West doesn't want to cover it. And China and Russia, let's be honest, they're not trying to make waves around this. They want this to work, they want it to go well, but it's a protracted issue and struggle that's going to take a long time because a lot of it is dependent upon both can Palestine and the Palestinian resistance defeat Israel once and for all? And a big part of that defeat is the United States's um, uh, it's the United States that has to pull back on this and has to be forced to pull back on this. Its support for Israel and its, of course, facilitation and coordination. I'll always put that word coordination in there because it's its coordination of this genocide which keeps it going. And, that places big constraints and barriers on the multipolar world on what they can do. So, in any effect, that is where I see things going with regard to how BRICS approaches Gaza. Sparky says, build a better world with BRICS. Yes, sir. Here we have Enoch again. Oh, here, Sparky again, actually. America deindustrialized in the 1990s and actively pushed their industries to China. Now America complains about it. Indeed. Sorry, guys. Wow. I'm still jet lagged, by the way. April 24th, 25th, technically, because it was like midnight the 24th, 25th, midnight the 25th. I came back. It's been more than a week from China, but I'm still feeling it. I mean, it's a long ways. It's a long way away. So Enoch, the first prophecy again says, what's the earliest timeline Syria and Venezuela to be added to BRICS? I've heard speculation in the past few months concerning both nations. I don't know. I mean, this is a good question. BRICS is keeping it. Russia, especially now that they're the ones hosting, they're the presidents of this round in Kazan this October. They're keeping it very close. We don't know exactly who is going to be admitted. We just know that there are a lot of applications. Syria and Venezuela make a lot of sense given their energy, their relationship to energy, as well as just how they have strengthened their relationships with the two biggest members of BRICS, Russia and China, and Iran over the years. BRICS needs to expand into Latin America. Venezuela would be a really good addition there, especially after Argentina. Argentina's self ouster. And of course, Syria, given the interconnectivity, the Iran relationship, the Belt and Road Initiative that Syria is now a part of, its historic relationship with Russia, it would make a lot of sense for Syria to come into. But I'm not sure. I mean, I think it could happen this round. I think it could also very well likely not happen this round, given that despite all the speculation, I think BRICS is going to have to work out its own internal financial issues and mechanisms, because I do think that countries under sanctions like Syria and Venezuela present huge challenges to the BRICS architecture, because it's not like Russia and China, which have these huge advantages over sanctions. Syria and Venezuela have certainly been resilient. But when it comes to how they're going to fit into the architecture of BRICS, how does that work under the sanctions regime? And I think that's something they're still trying to figure out. Sparky, make Israel Syria again in the Ottoman Empire. The Levant Jews got along with the neighbors just fine, whether Muslim, Christian, or otherwise. And Sparky says, fun fact, in 1492, the Ottoman Empire sent ships to rescue Jews from the Spanish Inquisition. Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. That's not my forte in terms of history. All right, everybody. So, a few announcements before we go. Okay. I don't. I hope that was a compliment. I'm seeing some of this. So, all right, we got some funny comments in the chat. So a few announcements, okay, before I head out of here. Number one, next stream, May 8th, Richard Medhurst is coming on the stream, friend of the show. Looking forward to that. That's 7:15 p.m. Eastern time. He lives far. He lives in a different time zone. He's willing to go on in the evening, which is very nice of him. But 7:15 p.m. Eastern time, Richard Medhurst on May 8th. And then after that, I'm working on stuff. I don't have anyone yet to be confirmed, but I'm gonna be working on other guests. If anything, I'll be back on individually, and maybe the guests will be on later in the month. Of course, sign up for Patreon. Suggest guests if you have any suggestions. I have a few in mind, a few new ideas in mind as well to get some other folks on here that I have been just unable to get on or haven't had time to get on. So, yeah. With any event, Phil says, been to China many times, jet lag is dreadful. It's so crazy because some days are better than others. So like now I'm like, whoa, what is happening? Like I'm feeling it because I remember feeling it when I was in China, and right now I'm feeling that. It's so awkward. Anyway, so it's like an exhaustion that's just different. Yeah, so Richard Medhurst May 8th, then more to come. Okay. Keep hitting that like button, keep hitting that subscribe button, keep hitting that notifications bell. Go to the video description, sign up for Patreon, Substack, and more. Okay. Become a YouTube member if you can. I want to shout out. There's one by Philip Lim, gave 3 coffees. Thanks so much for buying me those coffees. Rockfin, there was a lot of tips today. Thanks so much for all those tips from Laura, Bob, Hugh, Thomas, and Alan. I don't even know if I can get those tips, but I'm gonna try. And then thank you so much for the Rockfin and Rumble family, especially those on Rumble. Thanks so much. Please do sign up there, rumble.com. Search Danny Dhaiphong. Okay. All right, everybody. That's it for me. Take care. Have a good one. I'll see you in 3 days. Bye-bye.